Priesthood apologies for the late start. We've had some serious IT issues here near Kolob. I think the Wi-Fi has gone down, and I'll have to speak with the gardener about that. Some people have been asking how they can support the blog and the show. The best ways to do that are to subscribe to the show on YouTube. Go to your social media. We're on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter. Follow us there. And also in the description below, there's a link to the tips page if you are feeling generous. Today's show is a very special one that I've been looking forward to all week. We have with us, coming all the way from the United States, Paul Toscano. Some of you may know him from the September 6th, but as I put in the description, Paul is a lot more than just the September 6th. Paul has worked at BYU with the Ensign. His mission, we're about to hear, was epic. He's rubbed shoulders with some of the biggest names in Mormonism that you will remember from your time growing up and coming through the ranks. But hello, Paul. Thanks for coming to us.
James, it's good to be on your show.
Fantastic. So, Paul, I want to speak first about how you became a Mormon, what it was that brought you in. Everyone has a different journey. A lot of people have been born into Mormonism, but I understand it was different for you. How did you first come across Mormonism?
Well, I was in high school, and I had a friend who was a Mormon by the name of Blaine Lee, and he was very gung-ho about the program that the church had back in the early 60s, which was every member a missionary, and he basically proselyted me while I was in high school.
Okay.
And he said, what do you know about the Mormon church? Would you like to know more? And I said, absolutely not. I'm a Catholic. I have my own religion. I don't know what this is about. But over time, he kind of talked me into meeting with the missionaries. And I was very interested in Mormon doctrine. I was certainly not interested in Mormon culture, but I was interested in Mormon doctrine. And so eventually I became converted.
Did you feel like it was a big stretch from Catholicism to Mormonism, or did you find parallels there?
Oh, I always thought that there were more parallels between Mormonism and Catholicism than Mormonism and Protestant. And I still hold that view.
Yeah, you see, I think I felt it was kind of the other way around, but I think that was a layman's kind of view of it. But there was always the story that I told as a missionary and that was told to me, I think it's a famous one, of the Catholic priest, I think, who spoke to a Mormon and said it was either they had the truth or we had the truth, and that it was only one of the two, because either the Catholics had the priesthood down through the ages, through Paul, etc., from Christ himself, or if they were wrong, we were the restoration of things, but no one else could claim truth. It was only those two things. And I think the way that the church kind of frames the Catholic Church as being the whore of all the earth and different things kind of knocked that one out of the park and made at least me as a missionary feel warm and fuzzy.
There are a lot of candidates for whore of the earth. Not that the Catholic Church is really anymore at the top of the list.
Yeah, well, yeah, I'd put the Mormon Church up there at the minute, but we move on. So Catholicism, I think, kind of moves into your mission field, or you move into the mission field of Catholicism. And where did you serve your mission?
Well, I served my mission in Italy when the Italian mission was one mission. It was originally a kind of subset of the Swiss mission, but it became its own mission in 1966. And when I was called, it was still part of the Swiss mission. But when I arrived in Italy in October of 1966, it was its own mission.
Okay. And you were able to do something quite special as a missionary. Before you tell us what it was, what I'd like to know as well is why you? Because there will have been other missionaries there, I'm sure. So as you tell us, also, why did you have the privilege?
of doing that. Well, let me tell you one little story before this, because I think it lays a foundation. I had to lie to go on my mission. I had to lie to my bishop to go.
Didn't we all?
Well, this is a very peculiar lie. And that is when I was interviewed by Bishop Minor, my bishop in Baldwin Park, California. I lived in West Covina, and I was in the Baldwin Park 2nd Ward. He asked, I was coming back from my freshman year at BYU. It was during the Vietnam era, so I didn't think I was going to go on a mission because we didn't have a quota. We had 2 had already gone to Italy from my ward, and there was no more quotas for any missionaries. But he called me in one day and said, there was another ward that had an open quota, an open spot. We took it. I'm calling you to go on a mission. I didn't think I was going to go to Italy, but I said, oh, great. I guess I can go if I can come up with the money. And we were talking, and I mentioned to him how at BYU I'd taken a lot of religion courses in the year or 2 that I was there, and how I'd learned that Joseph Smith had started practicing polygamy as early as the early 1830s. And he stopped in his tracks, and he looked at me and he said, Elder, Joseph Smith never practiced polygamy.
Wow.
That's a teaching of the reorganized church. And I can't send you on a mission if you believe the false teachings of the reorganized church. And at first I thought he was joking, because of course the reorganized church is the one that believes that Joseph Smith never practiced polygamy. At least that was true in the early 60s.
Yeah.
And so I looked into his face, and I realized he was serious. He was a simple creature, this bishop. And so I had an opportunity either to correct him or to lie. And I realized I couldn't correct him because he wouldn't believe me. So I just lied and said, I'm a convert. I must have gotten it mixed up. I guess Joseph never practiced polygamy. And based on that lie, I was sent on my mission.
Okay.
And when I got there, to answer your question that you asked me, in January of 1967, I was one of 2 missionaries that was called to open the city of Rome. And David Brody was my senior companion. I was his junior companion. He was the district leader, and we opened Rome. And he was eventually transferred out. And I was still there in July of 1967. And that was when the word came down that we should dedicate the city. And I was probably the only missionary left from the first group that went. And because I had opened Rome, I guess they figured that they would ask me to do the dedicatory prayer, which I did early one morning in July from, I think, the Palatine Hill. And we huddled up there and got on our knees, and there was no one else around. And I dedicated the city. I don't know whether you can see these notices coming in, these banners.
Nope, you're fine.
Anyway, I dedicated the city of Rome, and I blessed all the people and all the livestock and all the plants and all the structures and everything that I could think of. And it must have worked, because here 55 years later, they're dedicating a temple.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that my prayer had anything to do with that.
I can see the church history video now of these elders knelt down. I'm sure they'd rename you something else, but I can see it at sunrise on the hill, looking over the city. It's the perfect kind of faith promoting story.
That's not how it was. We were surrounded by trees and bushes, sitting on the ground. We couldn't see anything, but
wow.
Though we couldn't see it. And incidentally, there was a video that came out recently about the Rome Temple, and one of the old missionaries was in it, and he mentions this story of the dedication of the city of Rome by the missionaries. But of course, because I'm an excommunicant, I was not mentioned.
No.
I've been pretty much stricken from all the obelisks and all of the records of the church as an excommunicant.
Persona non grata.
I'm a persona non grata.
They used to do that with the Roman legions. If they did it with Julius Caesar, with his legion. In the, I'm showing my poor education here, but they'd strike off the stone. The legion would be up on the stone. They'd literally chisel it off. And but I think that's what they've. It must get difficult because of the way that you are intertwined in some of these stories, because
there are articles I wrote for the Ensign that you can't find in the main index because I wrote them.
Yes. Yeah, like I didn't even think that when you said that you worked at the Ensign, that your name would be all over the place, and they've just taken it out.
Not anymore.
Fair enough. Now, something for those joining us. Before the call, we were just speaking, and I was saying I was talking about how you kind of lived and came through part of church history where things were still happening, like you dedicating the Rome the city of Rome, not the temple, sorry, and like the fact that you were able to be in a church that was still small enough to be. It was big enough on the world stage to be known, but it was small enough so that the people inside it had closer connections to the top. I know my dad, when he was stake president, it was still at a time when they flew the stake presidents out once a year for training at General Conference. Whereas now, the last 20 years, maybe 30 years since the 90s, the church has gone in the direction of, multi-level management and different things. And you can never get past the middleman these days. But you were able to be there with the very top. And we're going to talk.
We had a saying that the church was big enough to give you the economy deal, but small enough to give you the hometown service. And I met a lot of I had a number of interviews, contacts with Harold B. Lee, and one long interview with him that went on for an hour and a half. I had a personal interview with Spencer Kimball. After I was excommunicated, I received word from Howard W. Hunter that he thought highly of me and he was not happy with my excommunication.
What was his call at the time?
He was the president of the Council of the 12 when he said that, but a couple of months later, he became president of the church.
I was going to say it was close to that time, wasn't it? And maybe as president of the Council of 12, he'd got the latitude to be able to say that at the time. But as president of the church, he would have been.
Well, the reason I was excommunicated was because Ezra Taft Benson was comatose. And because he was not functioning, there was an apostolic interregnum where the counselors to the first presidency, who were Gordon Hinckley and Thomas Monson, were they are a little bit diffident about running the church without a president who's able to function. And so they create what they call the Council of the First Presidency and the Council of the 12. And they meet together during this apostolic interregnum. And when that happens, the apostles have a lot more say-so than normally do. And Boyd Packer was the senior member of the 12, had a great deal of say-so. And he was the one who had engineered, and I would say connived, the excommunication of the September 6th. He even went down to Salem, Utah, where Avraham Gileadi was living, and the stake president down there wouldn't excommunicate Avraham. And so Boyd Packer arranged for the stake president to be released, and he appointed a new stake president who did excommunicate Avraham Gileadi.
That's one way to get around it.
Boyd Packer, his biggest problem was that he confused the church with the Air Force. And he thought of himself not as a general authority, but an actual general giving orders. And he did step over the line because he did connive my excommunication because he interfered with it by talking to my stake president, Kerry Hines, at the time. And Steve Benson, if you look up Steve Benson, who was the grandson, was the cartoonist for years for the Arizona Republic. He's a Pulitzer Prize-winning editorial cartoonist. He, at his website, which anybody can get online and see, he's got the whole story about how that went down and how Dallin Oaks lied to cover up Boyd Packer's involvement in my excommunication. So it all came out in the newspaper finally, but it was very embarrassing for Dallin Oaks and Boyd Packer.
Oh, I think Dallin Oaks is going to have some more embarrassment in the coming weeks because he's just been. I think it's starting to hit the mainstream press, at least over in California, where he lied about his involvement in the shock and vomit therapy at BYU. And yeah, some of the secular papers are starting to pick that up now. So that'll be fun for him.
He keeps doing this. I don't know why.
I don't know if he's getting to the point where he's just a little bit senile, or if he's
he's senile.
If he's just,
I think he's just covering up because his view is, and all of their view is, that they have to line up behind their senior apostles, and they will do what's necessary to cover for them.
Yeah.
That's the whole problem with Mormonism. The whole problem with Mormonism is that junior apostles over the history of the church have had to sustain and back up their senior apostles even when they were dead. And that's why the church racism happened. Joseph Smith, I don't think, was particularly at all racist. I mean, I've got a lot of evidence to suggest that he did not buy into the racist picture at all in his day. But Brigham Young was racist, and then once he made these public racist statements, his juniors, all the way down to Russell Nelson, have got to put on the show that none of them ever made a mistake. They've never said anything that was false. And so that's...
Well, if we go back a little bit, back into your time in the church, and thinking of BYU, maybe before you joined BYU later in life, did you ever have any, I guess, contact with Ernest Wilkins? Wilkins.
Well, I did have a contact with Ernest L. Wilkinson, who was the president of BYU. And yes, I did. When I was, I had a short, unsuccessful stint in musical theater, and my Gary Fisher and I, who we were both in the opera workshop, went over and talked to Ernest L. Wilkinson about, I can't even remember what it was about, but it was something about his constant rumor was that he was going to interfere with the arts, or I can't remember what. But I actually sat down and met with Ernest L. Wilkinson to register this complaint, but it got nowhere. But I remember meeting with Ernest L. Wilkinson.
Okay, so I heard he was a bit of a ball breaker, but
he was a strange man.
Very diplomatic. So you went on to the BYU faculty, but before you actually took up your post on the faculty in 1972, you had an interview with an assistant to the 12, Bernard P. Brockbank.
Every faculty member had to be interviewed by a general authority.
Okay. So
I drove up to Salt Lake and went to the church office building. Back then, it was very different than it is now. It was they built the big tall building, but the administration building, it's a beautiful building, it's a jewel of a Greek type architecture. But back then, they still had genealogical microfilm reading machines that you could go in. Church members had a lot more access with the general authorities in the late 60s and even early 70s.
Yeah.
And so when I went, you could, I met Bruce McConkie jumping down the steps and jumping over the railing to the next step. You could see that. And Joseph Fielding Smith in the 60s, this was Joseph Fielding Smith Jr., who became the 10th president of the church. You could see him wandering around the hallways. Wow. General authorities were much more accessible. By the time I became a faculty member, which was in the early 70s, that was less so. So when I went to the big, tall building to meet with Bernard P. Brockbank, and I went into his room. He was putting on his jacket. He gestured to me to sit down, and he sits in his chair across the desk from me. And he says to me, "Do you believe in God?" And I said, "Yeah, I do. I believe. I'll go you one better. I actually believe in Jesus and the Holy Ghost." And he says to me, "There is a God, you know." Okay. I said, "Okay, I believe that. The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament sheweth his handiwork." And I said, "Okay." And he went on like this a little bit. And then he suddenly stood up, put out his hand. I shook it. He said, "Good afternoon." And so I left. And that was very odd. The next day, there was a devotional assembly that at the BYU. I went to the devotional assembly. Who should be speaking but Bernard P. Brockbank, who gets up to the microphone, and the first thing he says, "Do you believe in God?" There is no. The heavens declare the glory of God. He was practicing his speech on me. So that was a very peculiar interview, I felt.
Oh my gosh, that's so random.
I don't know what to say about that. I mean, it speaks for itself.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, there's nothing like, I just thought it'd be like a temple recommend interview, something standard like that. But just to doorstep you with that,
he doorstepped me.
Maybe he just felt that you didn't ridicule him, and that he felt your spirit, and your spirit was kind, so he was good with you continuing on. So
my spirit was kind. It was more bewildered than anything.
Deer in the headlights. So your time at BYU, you were the faculty supervisor for student publications, and as well you organized the first BYU Festival for Mormon Arts.
I did. I mean, what happened was that I got back from my mission. I didn't have very good grades before my mission. When I got back, I did very well. I got all A's all the time. And I graduated in English, and then I got a master's degree in English literature, focusing on Shakespearean literature. And then in the process of doing that, I was also asked to, I was on the yearbook staff, and then I became a reporter briefly for the student newspaper. And then I was asked to start up a magazine for the university called the Monday Magazine, which I was the charter editor for. And as a result of my work on the Monday Magazine, I became friends with Lauren F. Wheelwright, who was the dean of the College of Fine Arts and Communications. And he asked me to join the faculty of communications to supervise all the student publications. Okay. So that's how I got that job. Now, the faculty was very upset at him for doing this because they felt they had no say in that appointment. And so as a result of that, I could feel the pressure. They didn't really want me on the faculty. And so I resigned from the faculty, and after that took a position at the Ensign magazine up in Salt Lake. But while I was serving as the supervisor of the student publications, Lauren F. Wheelwright, who had written a book about Mormon arts, wanted to have a festival of Mormon arts. Yeah. And so I actually coordinated that festival for the first time. Okay. I mean, it was just getting a bunch of artists to make contributions. I had to supervise the publication of, through the printing press there, the BYU press, a bunch of different kinds of printed materials, and get the music department to put on the big festival ball that they had. So that's what I did. It was just grunt work.
Okay. I remember as a child, one of the highlights of church was the BYU dancers came across and did a tour. I don't know if it was of Europe or just Great Britain, but I do remember as a small child going and sitting in wasn't a church. I think it was like a leisure centre kind of sports hall. And they did some fantastic dancing. I'd never seen anything like it in my life.
Yeah.
Sorry?
I think they had a ballroom dance group that went around, and they also had folk dancers.
Yeah, I think it might have been I don't know. I just remember the lights went down and like black lights came on, and they were all wearing stripes, so they looked like stick men and dancing. But I just thought it was amazing, and for me, that was kind of a faith affirming thing. Like, oh wow, no one does it like BYU does it. And you, even over here in the UK, you develop some sort of like BYU are amazing at everything. Football, some would argue, but it was BYU and the 49ers. And that was it for kind of American culture in the UK. If you were Mormon, those were your teams. University of Utah, it's not even a university, was it? But we'll get there. We'll get there. I think we've missed one major factor in your life, and that was how you met your wonderful wife.
Well, I met her through a friend of mine, Guy Potter, who married her. She was married to Guy before she married me. They weren't married in the temple. Eventually, he was a little bit broad-minded, so to speak. Perhaps that is a very apt expression. And so she eventually divorced him because he wasn't particularly faithful.
Okay.
And but I have to say, Guy was he was a very interesting man. He was a friend of mine and of Margaret's, and he was quite a serious researcher into Mormon history. And so they got married. I was a witness at their wedding. And then they got divorced. And then after that, I married Margaret. Yes. And we were married in the temple.
Fantastic.
Although when we were married in the temple, the temple sealer thought it was a sealing and not a wedding. So he treated it like we were already married. And then at the end of the ceremony, he asked for the child to be brought in so that the child could be sealed to us. And everybody was astonished, including me. I turned to Margaret and I said, "Do we have a child I don't know about?" So the sealer got it all mixed up. And but we assumed that the sealing worked, that the temple marriage worked. And so I really knew Margaret for a while before I married her.
Yeah, I attended my brother's wedding in Canada, much like you do them in the States. It's all in the temple. Over here in the UK, we have to get married civilly outside the temple first, and then go and be sealed at the temple. But my dad was a temple sealer at the time, and he got permission, a letter from the First Presidency, to take with him to the temple in Alberta to perform the sealing or the wedding for my brother and his wife. And just as you do in the sealing room, we went through the whole process. And then my dad said at the end that he'd done the wrong ceremony, and he'd done the ceremony for just as wrote, as if it was for and in behalf of someone who has passed on. And he's like, oh, there's a few paragraphs extra if it's a living wedding. So he had to start again, go back to the beginning, and start it all again. I'm like,
yeah. Well, mistakes happen.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure God's big enough and ugly enough to be able to get over a couple of paragraphs.
To realize that the Lord looks over many things.
Yeah. Well, it's the classic Sacrament Prayer. When I was bishop, I was sat on the stand, and there was an older brother blessing the sacrament, and I think it must have been 5 times he'd redone it, and he just couldn't get it right. And my counselor kept looking at him and do it again, and I just turned to him and I said, "I really don't care anymore. It's been blessed enough. Yeah, like we will get through. We will get by. Stop embarrassing the man." Mm-hmm. So now you said something that's a little bit left field, and I think when we all think of the Watergate scandal, we think of torches in an office building and Forrest Gump looking down and seeing that, and then calling someone and saying, I don't, very innocently, that there's some tortures, and it was the biggest scandal at the time from the American government. Obviously now you've had Donald Trump and different things, but you found yourself in the middle of the Watergate scandal and in the Oval Office.
Yeah, I just happened to be in Washington. I'd left BYU. I'd worked. I left BYU for the ensign, and then I left the ensign. And then I was looking around for a job, and somebody suggested that the United States Information Agency was hiring people, because I was very much interested in being a journalist. I didn't have being a lawyer on my radar at that time. So I went out to Washington, and a friend of mine was serving as an intern in the White House, in Nixon's White House. And he just invited me over, and I went in, and Nixon was down the hall getting a haircut. He was to get the true haircut a year later when he resigned. But I was just happened to be there. I had been watching the Watergate hearings, and happened to just wind up in the Oval Office during the Nixon administration. I mean, there's nothing more than that. It's just odd.
You can see it now, though, that, a week later, special forces come through the door at 5 a.m. because some chain of events, something's happening, some information's gone missing, and you quite innocently just happen to be walking, through the Oval Office, as you do, and they think you're some Russian spy or something like that. I could see it.
Yeah, I could have been sucked into a B-movie plot, right?
Yeah. And then you say to your wife, she just looks at you, she's like, seriously, what's going on? No, awesome. I just think it's amazing that you were even there. I think at the same time, it was that time in the world where there was that sort of access, whereas now you wouldn't even get close to the West Wing without so many checks and vetting and all sorts of things happening. Whereas back then, there was just access to these places, and you could have these stories. So.
Well, here's one that we kind of skipped over. In 1966, when I was called on my mission, there was no language training mission. We just spent a week at the Salt Lake missionary home and then sent to Italy. Well, while I was there, I had wanted to ask Harold B. Lee what he thought of the Adam God teaching.
Ooh.
And so I called from the mission home there. I called his office. Well, I was expecting to get his secretary and kind of try to wrangle an interview, but he picked up the phone. He picked up his own phone. He said, "This is Elder Lee." And I said, "Oh." I said, "Well, I'm Paul Toscano. I'm in the mission home on my way to Italy, and I wanted to ask you a question about Adam God. But honestly, Elder Lee, I thought your secretary would pick up the phone and that I would make an appointment." He said, "Come right over, right now." I said, "Now? I'm not supposed to leave here." He says, "Well, I give you permission to leave. Come over right now." So I went over to the church administration building, and I was escorted immediately up to his office. He had a big corner office. And I went in, and he's sitting at his desk, and he said, "Now, Elder, what's your question?" I said, "Well, I read that Brigham Young taught that Adam was God, and I'm just kind of curious as to what your thoughts were about this." He said, "Well, my thought is that it's a false and pernicious doctrine, and you should forget all about it." And I said, "Well, Brigham Young taught it, so what am I to make of that?" He said, "Forget about it." I said, "Okay, I'll forget about it." I wasn't sure I was really going to forget about it, but I've learned with my bishoply honor that sometimes it's better to let things slide. And then he was very harsh with me. He was very blunt and very harsh.
Wow.
And very stern. And it could show on my face. And so, but then I had an idea popped in my head. I said, "I have one more question, Elder Lee, and if you don't mind." He said, "Well, what is it?" And I said, "Will you ever be president of the church?" Well, I might as well have rung Big Ben, the bell just sounded, right? Because he just went off for an hour and a half explaining to me, yes, apostolic succession and how it worked, and where he was in the line of authority, and why it would happen the way it did, and then he expatiated on a number of other subjects. And I sat there listening to Harold B. Lee discourse like this, and he just warmed up to me. And by the end of it, he gave me a pat and a shake of the hand and sent me off. And
oh my!
That interview with Harold B. Lee, when he was, of course, he was a senior. He was very powerful apostle at the time, and he was pushing correlation, which we initially thought was just lining up the lessons in all the various meetings that people go to, and that they would all be coordinated. But he was really bringing all of the auxiliaries and the Relief Society and the Sunday School and the YMMIA and the YWMIA and the primary. He was in the missionary program and the home teaching. He was bringing all of that under the direct control of the Quorum of the 12. And because his idea of correlation was to eliminate, well, back in the 60s and before that, the church was a loose confederation of warring tribes.
Yeah.
It was it was confederated. I'm plugging in my phone because it's going to lose power. So here, let me do
no
that.
worries.
And it's going to be difficult because I've got to. Am I still there?
Yep, we got you.
Sorry, folks. Live. My phone would lose power. Anyway, he would, and so he talked about correlation in that meeting with me and what his intent was. And I thought it was a good idea at the time. I didn't realize that this was a move toward absolute power for the apostles.
Yeah.
And that it would move the church inexorably to the condition that it is in today, where there's very little room for disagreement or for different ideas. Everything has to be approved. So no matter where you are in the church administration, you have to be approved by another committee, until eventually you get back to the first presidency and the Council of the 12. So they run everything.
Yeah. Well, I think the correlation committee are just having a heyday with Russell M. Nelson at the minute when it comes to some of the announcements he comes out with and his U-turns. When I genuinely think, so he speaks about his process of revelation. He's got a little notebook in his bedroom, and sometimes at night he will ask Wendy to leave because he's about to receive revelation, and he will write in his notebook what the Lord has told him. And then I genuinely think he just wakes up in the morning and he's like, right, we're going to do this. And he tells everyone we're going to do this. The last one was cancelling priesthood session of conference. because, it'd been revealed to him we didn't need priesthood session anymore because everyone can watch. There's no need to just gather the priesthood, even though that had been, from the beginning of the church, gathering all the priesthood in the earth in the same place. So he did that, and then 3 days later, they came out and they reinstated the session, but not as priesthood session now, just as a special session for everyone else. And it is, I guess it's thought of that possibly he came up with that great idea, put the cart before the horse and made the announcement, and then someone came to him and said, you do realize that you're cutting 7 or 8 talks out of conference. So that's 7 or 8 times that the brethren won't be able to speak. So we're going to have to get the brethren in elsewhere, which will impact on some of the general authorities from around the world speaking, and it'll definitely impact on the time we have for sisters to speak. So they pedaled back on that pretty fast, but I do think that there's some committees, the correlation committees, and possibly others behind the scenes that struggle to keep up with him. So,
well, he's a disaster for the church, and the biggest aspect of his disastrous administration is the fact that they now are saying more and more, I hear it more and more from church leaders, that we learn line upon line, precept upon precept. This is something that they say more and more. Now, what this means is that this is a 180-degree turn in theology. Because what used to be believed was that Joseph Smith was the only real prophet we ever had, because he's the one from whom all of the scriptures emanate. But now they believe that basically their job was to pass on the church in at least as good a condition as they got it. That was Boyd Packer's big concern. But now I think Russell Nelson has, I think he's the source of it. He believes that every succeeding prophet is better than the last. That Joseph Smith was just the young founder, and that over the years the church is getting better and better because the Lord is adding line upon line, precept upon precept, and is on the basis of this idea that he can throw under the bus Thomas Monson, who used to love singing "I'm a Mormon Boy." No more singing that, because we can't say Mormon anymore. And Gordon B. Hinckley, who was the architect of the "I'm a Mormon" campaign, where a lot of diverse-looking people would appear on television saying "I'm a Mormon."
Yeah.
But you can't say that anymore, because I have to say I'm a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And so the reason he can do this, including what you mentioned about the priesthood meeting, was because he believes that the Lord is working, that the church is getting better and better.
Yeah.
Because with new prophet, the Lord is adding more line upon line, precept upon precept. And that's how they justify the changes in the temple. And that's how they justify everything that they do now, including their inexorable march toward being more like evangelicals than they were originally more like Catholics. I said they've become far more like evangelicals. I mean, I think you were telling me, or somebody was telling me, that Russell Nelson, not Russell Nelson, but Jeff Holland had given a speech about, where he's in support of the young creationist theory, that the earth only 7,000 years, because it mentions this in section 77, verse 6, which, if you read it carefully, that's not at all what it's talking about. It's just saying that the 7 seals in Revelation is connected with the 7 days of creation, but it's not a revelation about how old the earth is at all. It's just connecting these two symbols, saying this symbolism is connected to this symbolism, but neither symbol is enunciating some scientific statement about the age of the earth. But so they're splurging more toward conservative Protestantism and even the evangelical view, certainly the evangelical attitude toward the LGBTQ plus community.
Yeah.
So I find this a horrific development in the history of Mormonism.
Yeah. I think that they've decided. I mean, we're talking about, you know, someone who's a bit of an egomaniac, but I really feel that they know now that they're not getting non-religious people to become religious. But what they can do is they can get people who already have a background in religion, who were brought up Catholic or evangelical, and they can help them to make the transition there to Mormonism. But what they need to do is they need to bring Mormonism just a little bit closer, so that transition is not quite as much of a leap. Whereas probably the church that I grew up in, the church that you were, you know, a missionary in different things, it was quite a leap to go from mainstream Christianity to Mormonism. You know, you had to learn to grow horns and all sorts of things. Whereas now they'll show you their Jesus in a bathtub logo, and it's Jesus Christ Church because the name says it's Jesus Christ Church. Just like the company Apple has orchards and provides for starving children, you know, lots of apples because the name is Apple, you know, doesn't make it so. But
that's true.
And with the line upon line thing, I do think that's the case, but I think they've missed out one important word, and it is line upon redacted line, because every time they add a new line, they kind of just cross out the one underneath and add the new one.
If you actually go to the source of the line upon line, precept upon precept, I believe it comes from Isaiah. And in Isaiah, the Lord says, because you're such a backward, stiff-necked people, I'm going to give you line upon line, precept upon precept. It's a curse.
Yeah.
The curse, the reason why I think it's horrific, and because I said this a long time ago when I had my meeting with Dallin Oaks back in 1984 when he was first made an apostle. And I told him, I said, the problem with the church is that the apostles, you're the worst apostles in the history of Christianity. And the reason why you are is because you are under the erroneous view that you have the authority to change the gospel. But that's not true. The gospel is like your constitution. The gospel is what controls you. You don't have the right to alter the words of Jesus Christ when he was present with us on earth. You don't have that right. You're supposed to bear witness of him, not change his gospel. But they have come to believe that they have the authority to alter the gospel. And so rather than the gospel being about spiritual transformation, which Jesus presents in the New Testament as being born again, that which is born of the flesh is flesh, but you have to be born of the Spirit. You have to be transformed by a spiritual something that has to happen to you. That's not their message. Their message is, we're going to go back to being born of the flesh, and we're going to focus on the biological fleshly family, which we can seal together in the temple. And we're going to make that ordinance of the sealing of the biological family the apex of Mormonism. That's what we're going to peddle to the world. You guys have got all kinds of stuff, but what we can do with our priesthood is we can seal your family together so you're all together in the hereafter, which sounds okay until you realize that what they mean by family is this obedient, compliant group of people that submit to the patriarch of that family.
Yeah.
Who basically subordinate their judgment to the judgment of the leaders of the church. It isn't at all about free will. It's extreme. It's very curious. One of the ways the church is not Catholic anymore, it's because it never really was, in the sense that in the Catholic Church, if you sin, the priest can absolve your sins. He can give you absolution. In the Protestant, beginning with Luther, and I'm not sure about Lutheranism, but at the time of Luther, but certainly after Calvin and Melanchthon and the Protestant Reformation, I mean, there was no way to get absolution in the Protestant church. You were either predestined to hell or predestined to heaven, and the good works you did were really manifestations of an already existing determination by God. So you don't really need the devil in Protestantism. God is the devil. He sends you to hell. He sends you to heaven. It's all fixed from the beginning. That was the religion of the Enlightenment. It's very logical, but it doesn't leave much room for hope.
Yeah.
In Catholicism, at least you could go to the confessional, confess your sins. That can be abused because you can go murder somebody, go confess your sins, and you can get an absolution maybe. But Mormonism doesn't have either one of those. It's kind of not predestination. It's not absolution. You're just kind of always under the thumb of your priesthood leaders in these personal interviews. So it's really the worst of both.
Yeah. It's what came to mind was a spiritual eugenics program. They want to just narrow down to this spiritual profile, which they see as being fantastic and the perfect member, and then everything else can be cast off and passed down. So we had some foreshadowing to your 1993 I guess excommunication in 1980, when you say you were informally excommunicated and had your record annotated.
That's true. In 1980, Margaret and I, we had a bishop in the Orem ward, in our Orem ward, who believed that somehow, it starts. I was in a bishopric at BYU. When I was single, I was called into a bishopric, and the stake president who called us was released, and a new stake president was put in. And this new stake president was extremely simple-minded and very, very conservative. And for some reason, he didn't like my bishop or me as the first counselor or a second counselor, and he wanted us out. And he released us. And after we were released, some of the students at BYU would come over to our house just to visit and talk. And this, I don't know how this happened actually, but our bishop in Orem got wind of this, and he was contacted by the stake president who had released us, and he was told by that stake president that we were troublemakers and that we should not be allowed to speak or anything and not have any callings. And so, and that bishop in Orem was, there are a lot of simple-minded people in the church, and they do get into leadership positions. And so that bishop took him at his word. And so, in fact, we were scheduled to speak in the ward and for sacrament meeting, and he called us in just before the sacrament meeting and said, "I've heard word from your old stake president that you're troublemakers, and so if you say anything out of line, I'm going to push this button and you're to sit down. The red light will go on the podium and you're to sit down and stop speaking." And I said, "Well, how do I know what you think is out of line?" I said, "I don't know. What do you want me to be wary of?" He said, you just don't say anything out of line." So Margaret spoke, and then I spoke. The light didn't go on the podium, but the light went on in my head that this was going to lead to trouble. And what happened was that bishop, who is a bishop of a normal ward in Orem, Utah, his stake president our actual stake president in Orem, commenced a 6-month investigation of Margaret and I, in which we were called in on a number of occasions, with Margaret holding our baby. I was holding one baby and she was holding the other. And they would interrogate, particularly me, about my beliefs. And I said, well, okay, I had answered their questions, but it became very antagonistic. And I am sorry to say, I don't suffer fools lightly. Yeah. And so I told him, I said, look, there are general authorities who teach really horrible things and they never get in trouble. And I haven't said anything that you pointed out that is unscriptural, and I'm in trouble. So what is this favoritism for these leaders? He said, well, give us an example. I said, well, you take this Sterling W. Sill. Yeah, Sterling W. Sill. He's an insurance salesman who they made an assistant to the 12. And he's up at Rexburg at the church school up there. And I got a transcript of what he said. He told the students, well, the Lord said, do not put your treasures are in heaven. The Lord said, your treasures are in heaven. And then he says to the students, if it makes sense to build up your treasures in heaven, doesn't it also make sense for you to build up your treasures on earth? And then he starts giving them economic investment advice. and so I'm saying this to them as an example of false teaching. And the stake president says to me, well, what's wrong with that? And I said, because the Lord starts out by saying, do not lay up unto yourselves treasures on earth, but lay up unto yourselves treasures in heaven. I said, this man is contradicting the statement that the Lord makes in the New Testament. Why isn't he under investigation? Silence. So this is the kind of stuff that went on in 3. They started at 6 at night and ended at midnight. We did this 3 times with them, and they're investigating us. And at the end of this 6-month period, I get a call from the stake president's first counselor, and he says, we are not optimistic about finding any evidence against you. We are not optimistic about finding any evidence against you, so we're dropping the charges. Well, after that, we moved to Salt Lake, and in this new ward, I was called to be the elders quorum teacher, but the next week I was released, and the elders quorum president told me, he said, look, I'm not supposed to tell you this, but the reason why you were released is because your records indicate there's something wrong. Oh. And I thought, okay, let me check on that. So my friend was Hartman Rector Jr., who was a general authority. And so I called him up and I said, Hartman, do you think my records might be tagged? Because I just got released from a calling I was just called to. And the elders quorum president told me it was at the behest of the stake president. And he said, there's something wrong with me. I would wonder what's going on. He said, I'll check. So about a few days later, he calls me back and he says, yeah, your records have been tagged. And you're not supposed to get any callings. And you're not supposed to receive any, I don't think you could get a temple recommend. He said, I said, well, is there anything that can be done about it? He says, I can't do anything about it. So it was a kind of an informal excommunication that happened in 1980. And it was after that, because up until then, I would not speak outside. I would not be one of the many general authorities in Education Week who was trying to make a name for themselves. Yeah. I wouldn't do that. And either would Margaret. But after that, we decided that all bets are off. We're going to start speaking at Sunstone. So in 1984, Margaret actually was the first, between the two of us, she was the first one of us to give a speech at Sunstone. And her speech was a seminal speech on the subject of women in the priesthood. It was called The Forgotten Place of Queens and Priestesses in the Establishment of Zion. And I'm forgetting the full title, but that was the subtitle. And yes. And that was given in 1984. And it was, people heard it, and then they wanted her to give it again the next day because other people wanted to hear it. Big deal. Well, I was babysitting the kids the first day she gave it, and so I got a babysitter so I could hear it the second time. And then the next year I began giving speeches at Sunstone. I'd give maybe 2 a year.
Yeah.
And these are all collected in my books, which are all available on Amazon. But the first book I think that came up is The Sanctity of Dissent.
Yes.
And then the Sabbath of Doubt. And then there was the Sacrament of Doubt, the Sabbath of Death. And then The Serpent and the Dove is my most recent one. It was 6 years old now. And so in these books, I collected most all of those presentations that were given at Sunstone in the years from 1985 right through probably 1994.
Okay. And we had a couple of questions in the chat that we were looking at. Valerie Hoyle asked, just going back a little bit to the way that the leaders put things line upon lines. Do you think that the changes that Nelson has made when he dies, that things will be changed back to whatever the next prophet decides? Are we, I guess, happy to say that the next prophet won't think twice about throwing Nelson under the bus?
Well, I think there's a way that the next prophet could throw Nelson under the bus by saying that the decision on the name change for the period of time, but it's not necessary to go on. It's not an eternal principle.
Yeah, soften the view on it.
How I handle that.
Make Mormon okay again.
Like of his, they'll say, well, for the period of time that he was the prophet, that was important that we deal with that, but now that time is past and we can go on to something else.
Yeah.
They'll always find a way to have their way.
Yeah, they'll always twist it one way or another. And Donald Allen says as well that leaders have decided that the obedient are the wheat and others are now tares. And I think that makes sense, because if you're not a yes man, you're not going to toe the party line, then.
Yeah, except for the fact that obedience is the first law of hell. Obedience is the devil's plan.
Yeah.
Obedience is what every despot wants. Obedience is the core principle of crony capitalism, where you shove what trickles down is misery, and what percolates up is benefits. The burdens go down and the benefits go up. This is what the leaders of the church have opted into, and they can't get out of it now. So basically, it would take a miracle on the level of the party of the Red Sea in order to get this church back on target. They have moved the superstructure of the church off the foundation and onto this mud and sand. And how are they going to, it's collapsing in front of us. People are leaving. People don't believe them anymore. People in the church are told by Rusty Nelson to get vaccinated, and they won't get vaccinated because they're following Trump or something else. The church, it's over for them.
Yeah.
And what can I say? Back in 1992, when my friends and I organized the Mormon Alliance, we spent 6 weeks writing a 3 or 4 page letter to the general authorities listing these 12 or 13 points, 14 points, that I can't remember how many now, where we told them that if you continue to do this, you're going to lose the church.
Yeah.
And they all got the letters. They were all sent letters. They ignored them. And instead they excommunicated me and Levina, who was on that committee, and they excommunicated Lynn Whitesides, I think, was on that committee. They excommunicated some of us who had been, had the temerity to suggest that they might be wrong.
Wow. So it was total radio silence to the letter.
Oh, absolute radio silence.
Wow. And to say that, as you said, you've got friends who were general authorities, but there was no phone call or anything to say, you know, watch yourself or...
Well, no, Marlon Jensen contacted me regarding one of my speeches at Sunstone, where I was extreme. I have become more and more critical of the 12 apostles over the years, to the point where I sound hysterical. That's what's happened, because they don't listen.
Yeah.
But early on, Marlon Jensen wrote me a nice letter and said, I think you're right. There's a problem that we have here. And it's as if from your criticisms, it's as if you sat with us in a lot of these meetings, because your intuitions about what goes on here are right spot on. And but then he backed off, because he's under orders.
Yeah.
And I did get that very nice message sent to me from Howard W. Hunter when he was the president of the church. He said, tell Brother Toscano that I think highly of him and that we will try to make amends. But he didn't live long enough to make any amends.
Yeah.
And so it's not like they haven't heard me, and they haven't heard, they heard Michael Quinn, they heard Lavina Anderson, they heard some of the others that were complaining early on about how they were managing the church. They heard Hugh Nibley and his managers versus that he gave that to BYU that people know about. They heard about that, but they don't want to change. And that's because they have this ridiculous seniority system where you have to obey the guy up the ladder whose buttocks you're looking at as you're climbing up the ladder. You have to obey him. You have to obey the one above him.
Oh my gosh, the imagery.
Above him, until recently, felt like they had to obey the one that was dead. But I think Russell Nelson has figured out this line upon line, precept upon precept. They figured out a way to get around that. So now they can throw Brigham Young under the bus for racism.
Mm.
Although if you look at the history of racism in the church against people of Black African descent, that racism was pinned on the Lord.
Yeah.
Lord was blamed for the racism. It was treated as a revelation. The first presidency authorized special missionary lessons for the missionaries in Brazil so that they could eliminate anybody who had Black people in their genealogy. And they had a way of sorting that out and not baptizing. They were not only keeping Black men from getting the priesthood, they were keeping those families from getting the temple blessing. They were keeping them from getting the gospel.
Yeah.
Because Brigham Young was a racist. Mark Peterson was a racist. Harold B. Lee was a racist. Spencer Kimball had to wait till those guys were dead, and Mark Peterson was on some trip down in South America before he pulled the apostles together and prayed, Lord, you've got to forgive us.
Yeah.
And then, Bruce McConkie makes up this story about, the powerful feeling that they got was guilt. When they realized that they'd been peddling racism.
Yeah.
In the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Ghost.
Yeah.
Well, no wonder to me that, they go in the Holy of Holies and the Lord doesn't show up. I can understand exactly why he doesn't show up.
Yeah. And I have had conversations in the past with TBM family and friends who are still very active. And they say to me when I bring up the racism of previous brethren, they're like, oh, well, everyone's a bit racist in different ways. And, Brigham Young wasn't perfect. It's the old, they're not perfect argument. And
apparently people who don't think they're perfect, who have the view that they are perfect are them. The rest understand that they're not perfect. If only they understood that.
Yeah.
But they act as if, the Pope says, the Catholics believe the Pope is infallible, but no Catholic really goes along with it. Mormons teach that the prophet is not infallible, but they all don't go along with that. They all pretend like he is, and they act like he is infallible. So we have, where the Catholics have a de jure view of infallibility, we have a de facto view of infallibility. We think, oh yeah, it's not in the record that he's infallible, the prophet, but we're going to treat him as if he is, and that's what's happened. You cannot question them. You can't even have an interview where you question them.
No, I think that's one really fast way to get excommunicated, even quicker than yourself, you know, to actually publicly, they can't find me, so they can't excommunicate me, just so you know. I'm in hiding from the church. They don't have my current address, and I don't live anywhere near the address.
Don't be afraid to be excommunicated. It's not a bad life.
One day. It's not
the Spirit abandons you. And also Mike Quinn took the position that his excommunication was not valid because it was never sealed by the Holy Spirit of promise.
There you go.
And I may warn them that their second anointings are not sealed by the Holy Spirit of promise either. So if they have the idea that they can get second anointed and do anything that they want and then get a pass, they haven't read carefully our scripture. All of these ordinances are metaphors. Your salvation, your ordinations are not complete until God himself lays his hand upon you, was what Oliver Cowdery told the 12 in 1835. And they have forgotten that. And the other thing they've forgotten is that the 107th section says that the apostles aren't supposed to be hanging around Salt Lake running the church. They're supposed to be a missionary body.
Yeah.
And have authority with the first presidency only in the mission field where there's no church organized. They shouldn't be hanging around Salt Lake, lining up in order of seniority to go to the urinal. They should stop that. They need to get out of town.
Yeah. Well, they did get out of town. Last month, 3 of them came to the UK. It was Ballard, Holland, and Cook. And Holland stood up, and basically they did a special UK and Ireland conference, and they just told everyone, look, we know it's true. We're really old. We wouldn't have traveled across the world to see you if we didn't know it's true. So just trust us and follow. And Jeffrey R. Holland stood up, and I've put videos online, pretty much word for word. He said, Elder Ballard wouldn't tell you this, but I will tell you this. And he said, Elder Ballard, Elder Cook, he named their wives, he named his own wife, and he used the words that their salvation is sure. He said they got that sorted out a long time ago. He called it a free, or he called them home free, and said that they've got a permanent pass.
Yeah,
and
that's not true.
No, absolutely not.
It's not the doctrine of the church. It's their idea, but it's not the doctrine of the church.
Yeah, well, they love it. It makes them gods in this world, doesn't it?
I think Nemo, while he posted those briefly, I don't know whether you posted them or he did, but they were taken down. But before they were taken down, I watched all of it.
Yes.
And I'm sitting here in Murray, Utah, watching these men in the UK, thinking, how can they have the temerity to think that they are witnesses of Christ? They are counter witnesses. When you see them standing in the pulpit, I said this to one of my stake presidents, who was that stake president in Orange. I say, you stand up in the pulpit, and when the young men in the stake see you, they grab their testicles and run, because the last thing they want to be is like you. You are the worst exemplars of Jesus Christ that you could possibly find. You're not inspirational. You're just boring.
Yeah.
One of the great signs of heresy, other than, apart from burning people in the town square, the great signs of heresy is boredom. The boredom in Mormonism is the sign that the Spirit has departed.
Yeah.
It's boring, like you said, boy, the church was doing something back in your day, because you could still speak and get, I mean, an audience with I could sit down and had to sit down with Boyd Packer once. Fine, you could do that. You wouldn't make much headway, but at least you had access. Now it's all bureaucracy.
Well, I've been going back through general conferences, and in general conferences back then, they actually said something. Even though I might not agree with what they said something. General conferences have become so watered down. It's like, I don't know, it's nothing to it.
I have a hilarious story about that. Joseph Fielding Smith Jr., who became the 10th president of the church, was speaking at I think it was a state conference I was attending. He was a senior apostle. He was going to shoot into the presidency very soon. And he gives a speech taken from Isaiah. I can't remember the chapter, but it's that the women are with round tires like the moon, and they're made up of tinkling ornaments. And he was quoting all of this stuff, which is a metaphor for idolatry. And so he gets up and he uses it to try to convince the girls and women of the church not to wear makeup, not to doll themselves up, not to worry about fashion. That's how he interpreted Isaiah. He sits down, and his wife, Jessie Evans Smith, gets up and she says, well, I know he's an apostle and I know he's a senior, but we girls know that we all need a little makeup sometimes.
Oh my gosh.
And she contradicts him.
That's amazing.
And never gets up afterward and says anything about it.
Could you imagine?
Jesse used to follow him around and do this stunt every time he gave that speech. She would get up and say, yeah, but girls, we all know that we need a little makeup.
That's amazing.
That's a very different church.
Yeah.
That was kind of before correlation really set in.
Yeah. And I think it would have been refreshing to actually see, because sometimes on the lower levels now, when you get area authorities that come around different things, it's interesting to see that they are just people in marriages just like our own, and they have crosswords, and sometimes that happens on the stand, like you said, when a brother will say something and he'll reference his wife who's sat looking crossly at the back of his head and different things. But when you get to general conference levels now, but when you get to anyone that's on the payroll from maybe the first quorum of the 70 upwards, it's a very sterilized message.
Oh, very sterile. The horror is that when the women, the apostles' wives meet for lunch, they sit in order of seniority.
Never.
Of their husband.
Oh my gosh.
And there's that story that L. Tom Perry told. He let the cat out of the bag when he said when they meet on Thursday and they pass they get a free box of Cummings chocolates. In Salt Lake, we have a chocolatier. It's very good, Cummings chocolates, and they give a free box of chocolates every Thursday to the 12, and they hand it around in order of seniority.
Oh my
Tom
gosh.
Perry was not the chocolate I wanted until I got to be a senior member of the 12, because they pick them out in order of seniority. It's absurd.
Like you said, they all queue to the urinal in order of seniority.
They do. They queue to the yes.
Okay.
Urinal. We say urinal, but I think we both know what we're talking about.
Yeah. Well, there's one more story that I wanted to touch on, because you in the notes that we've got, it seems crazy Mormons, you've called it, Pemberley or Gasmatron, and being tossed out of the Mesa Temple.
Well, these are three stories. I'll try to tell them quickly. One day, my wife and daughters were walking along the University of Utah campus, and it is a university.
It is.
She is a tenured professor there and was chair of the department that she's in. She recently got out of being chair, so I can see her occasionally. but my daughter, a couple of daughters and she were walking across campus, and they met an old friend of hers, a kind of crazy guy. He used to have a thing for my wife before she married me. And he says to her, I've come up with a novel. And the novel is about Elizabeth Bennet and Mr. Darcy convert to Mormonism and go to Nauvoo.
Of course they do.
What do you think about that? See, I don't have to say more than that.
Can you imagine? I live maybe obviously near Kolob, but my earth home is about 200 meters from the house that the Bronte sisters grew up in, and there's nothing would be stranger than
somebody get one of the Bronte novels to somehow tie into Mormonism for some reason. Mr. Rochester goes to Nauvoo or something. Well, that was that story. The one about the orgasmatron was really weird. I'm not going to mention these people's names because I'm going to try not to mention. So I got this was back in the early 80s. I got a knock on my door in Orem, and these people I know come in, and they're telling me that they've come with information that they now know how to get revelation from the Lord every time. Okay. And I said, well, okay. And the way they do it was there was 3 couples. They'd go to the temple with a particular question that had to be answered yes or no. And they go to the temple, and the one fellow was apparently the one who was gifted with getting the revelation. And the way it would happen would be this: sometime during the temple ceremony, if the answer to their question was yes, he would get an erection.
Oh my God.
And if the answer was no, he wouldn't.
Oh my gosh.
And I thought, this is a rather curious gloss on this revelation about working with the rod. and of Aaron. And I thought, well, I want you all to leave, because I'm going to draw a line in the sand here and say that, this is, but once people, it's not about believing in the Lord in grace and believing in God's gospel through Jesus Christ. That isn't what makes people crazy. What makes people crazy is when they fixate upon some collateral issue like the age of the earth or the shape of the earth or polygamy, which is to me a collateral issue. It affects your belief in Joseph Smith as to whether he was actually getting revelations or not. But I could dismiss it and say Joseph was simply wrong about this, because polygamy has nothing to do with the spiritual transformation of me. It has nothing to do with rebirth. It has nothing to do with that narrative arc that goes from being born of the flesh, born of the spirit, and maturing spiritually, and coming to the point where, yes, God could appear to you and seal you to heaven. But he's not going to seal somebody to heaven who has been marinating in privilege in the Council of the 12 for the last 30 years. It's the widow's mite who he points out. It's the woman in Samaria that he is interested in. It's the woman who's going to be stoned for adultery that he's interested in. And when the 2 apostles tell him that, why don't we just rain down fire and lightning and fire on our enemies? And Jesus says, no, you got that wrong, James and John. That's not my gospel.
Yeah.
When it's people raining down judgment on others, when they decide to focus on masturbation as a sin next to murder. Yeah. And you say, really? If that were true, there would be a lot more murder in our ward. And so you have to it's a kind of fundamentalist attitude where rather than window back and try to understand what the gospel is about spiritual transformation, about not being immersed in pure materialism. It's about not seeing everything as a machine. The galaxy is a machine, the solar system is a machine, people are machines, animals are machines, because as soon as you do that, you're able to objectify them and use them like machines. You can treat the middle class and the lower class workers as machines that are at the disposal of the Elon Musks and the Bill Gateses and the whoever they are, the people that run Facebook or Google or whoever they are. They can use people like machines because they see them as extensions of the computer.
Yeah.
But the gospel of Christ is to see every individual as a soul, so valuable that Christ would come to earth and God would come to earth incarnate as Jesus Christ and lay aside his divinity and his sovereignty and his glory and his omnipotence and his omniscience and omnipresence, and lay all of that aside and say, I will come to you because you couldn't come to me. I will love you and want you to love me as equals. That's the gospel of Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
It's not about kingdom building.
Or money.
Yeah, money is the kingdom.
Yeah, you can buy anything in this world with money, and they're definitely selling it. So the final story of those three is your experience in the Mesa, Arizona temple. And
well, we went down tonight to be witnesses for our friends who were getting married in the temple in Arizona. And when we got there, we on the night before they were to get married, we went to the temple and went through an endowment session with both the bride and the groom.
Mm-hmm.
And we were to be the witnesses the next day.
Yeah.
So next morning, we get up early, we get dressed, we drive down with the bride and groom and their family to be witnesses. And we got to the Mesa temple, and we presented our temple recommends at the door, which we had done the day before. And it turns out that our bishop in Orem, who had received bad news from our previous stake president of BYU, he had called the temple presidency in Mesa and said that he was revoking our temple recommends.
Wow.
They were taken from us at the door, and we were not allowed in, and we weren't allowed to be witnesses. And we kind of walked around the Mesa temple my wife was more hysterical than I was. Very humiliating, because we were part of the wedding party.
Yeah.
We had to spend the rest of the day with these people without giving them much of an explanation of why we were kept from going to the temple.
What, you'd basically just been given a big black mark?
Oh, it was, yeah. I mean, if he had said, well, finish your wedding and then come back here and we'll give you an interview and see whether there's anything to what we've heard.
Yeah.
No,
Yeah, that's it's another level of that authority, though. You know, it's like it's just something else to hold over you. I do think that the church these days are more, I say understanding. I think they're less, even though at the top it's still ultimate authority. I think on a local level, there's less of that, because they know that if they take it away from people will just go somewhere else. You know, the information's there that the church has done a lot of silly things. And if they're not excommunicating as many people, they're disfellowshipping, because if you excommunicate someone, it's harder, it's a harder road back for them. And if they're taken by maybe church history issues, then they just don't come back. Whereas if you love them in,
excommunication has a lot more negative effect. It's a lot more powerful when there isn't a cataract of people leaving the church.
Yes.
Like a waterfall.
Yeah.
People leaving the church. Now they're thinking, well, maybe we shouldn't be so quick. But they still do it. If you can say just about anything, but if you criticize church leaders, you're done.
Yeah.
And the reason for that is because the current leadership of the LDS Church has basically turned its back on most of the revelations of Joseph Smith. The only one they really care about is that Joseph Smith got the priesthood and passed it on to them. And they interpret this priesthood as giving them absolute authority, even to change the gospel. Yeah. Jesus said, you can't serve God and mammon, and they say, yes, we can.
Yeah.
Jesus says you need to be born into a spiritual family. They say, no, we're going to seal the biological family. And they put the proclamation on the family out there as the new gospel. That Jesus says, well, your apostles are supposed to be in the mission field. They say, no, we're going to be a board of directors here in Salt Lake.
Yeah. Well, I genuinely think that the fewer scriptures, I know that they say, you read your Book of Mormon every day because that's like drinking the Kool-Aid on a daily basis for them. But when it comes to the Bible and anything outside the Book of Mormon, I genuinely think they wouldn't be bothered if you didn't read the Gospels, or if you didn't read the New Testament and the actual accounts of Jesus there, because everything they need is encompassed in the Book of Mormon, and they're the only ones that, they're not the only ones that have it, but that's their thing.
Well, it's true, but they don't really want people to actually close read the Book of Mormon, because I don't think the Book of Mormon stands for what they teach. I mean, for example, in the Book of Mormon, there is no Heavenly Father. Jesus is the Father and the Son throughout the Book of Mormon.
Yes, yes. And I've seen the scriptures where they've changed things to make it three individual.
I will disagree with you there, James. Joseph Smith changed it, but only because he's trying to make the other scriptures consistent with Mosiah 15. Because in Mosiah 15, Christ is revealed as the Father because he was conceived by the power of God, and the Son because of the flesh, they being one God, the Father and the Son. But if you ask yourself, I can understand the phrase, Christ is the Son because of the flesh. That's easy to understand.
Yeah.
But why does it say that Christ is God, Christ is the Father because he was conceived by the power of God? That makes no sense. It would make sense if you said Christ was the Son because he was conceived by the power of God. But it doesn't say that. It says that Christ is the Father because he was conceived by the power of God. What is the meaning of that very mysterious statement that appears at the outset of verse 3 of Mosiah 15? Well, I'll tell you. What it means is that before anything was created, God existed alone, full of glory, which represented all the potentials of the future, of an infinite future. And it is only when he conceived the creation that he becomes the Father of the creation. So in the moment that God, before anything was created but God, the eternal God that was infinite, the infinite essence, in the moment that God conceives in this timeless, spaceless energy thing, he conceives the creation. In that moment, he becomes the Father. But it's Jesus. Jesus is the Father. And because he enters his creation to assume our imperfections with us, he becomes the Son. So in the Nephi, where he sees the Virgin Mary, originally she was the mother of God. Later, Joseph changed it she was the mother of the Son of God.
Yes.
That's because he's making clear that she's not the mother of the Father that existed before creation. She is the mother of God after he incarnates. So he is the Son of God.
Okay.
So, in other words, there's only one supreme being, and that's Jesus Christ.
Okay.
Mormonism, Book of Mormon, doesn't teach Trinitarianism. It teaches exactly what it states in the frontispiece of the book, that the purpose of the book is to convince Jew and Gentile that Jesus is the Christ, the eternal God, manifesting himself to all nations. This is a completely different Godhead picture.
Yeah, so how...
And the only why there are other gods, that the only reason why in the Old Testament the first commandment is thou shalt have no other gods before me, is because there are other gods, but those are gods whom God has made gods. Us, theosis, that ultimately his goal is to bring all of his children into the Godhead. Now, we will not be like he was God from all eternity, but we are created gods in his image. And that's a message of the Book of Mormon, that it's not what the church manuals teach. What they do is subordinate Jesus to a fictitious heavenly Father that does not exist.
Okay.
There is no Father. There's only Jesus. Now, there are archangels. Adam apparently was an archangel who comes down and is Adam, and Jesus is the son of Adam in the sense that all people are. And maybe he might have been directly the son of Adam if we believe Brigham Young's story that Adam is a resurrected being, had intercourse with Mary, and they produced Jesus Christ. That was Brigham Young's teaching. And then maybe Adam in that sense is the father of Jesus' body. But Jesus is the supreme being. And that is not what the church teaches now. So the leaders of the church don't read the Book of Mormon very carefully. They just want people to read it as proof that the church is true and that they're the true leaders.
Yeah.
But they don't want people to read it for its theology.
No.
Because if you read carefully Mosiah 15 or Alma 13 or Alma 42, or if you read the Book of Ether, where the finger of the Lord, the brother of Jared sees the finger of the Lord, says, I didn't know you had a body. And a little bit later in that passage, the Lord says to him, yes, and this is the same body with which I will appear to the Nephites. Well, that should shock us right down to our core, because what body did Jesus appear to the Nephites with? A resurrected body.
Yeah.
So Jesus had already been resurrected. Nibley, I talked to Nibley about this years ago, and he said, oh yeah, the Book of Mormon suggests multiple resurrections. Well, people can lay down their lives and take it up again. Jesus can do this. I mean, this is Mormon doctrine, but the leaders of the church have pulled as far away as they possibly can so that they can do, like you say, try to convert more people who are already Christians and bring them in. But the reason, what they get is very fundamentalist, conservative thinkers who are willing to subordinate their judgment to the judgment of the Mormon leaders.
Okay.
So I went off there.
No, it's fine. It's fine. Well, we're coming to a close. I didn't want to. I think we covered some really interesting stuff, and we could go on for a lot longer. But the one question that I want to kind of pull this together with is, what do you think the future of the Mormon Church is going to be?
Well, I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. I wrote a book recently called Mormonism and Crisis, a critique and a defense. And in there's an essay called The Trajectory of Mormonism. And I think that unless there is, I think that unless there is some kind of miracle, I think Mormonism will go away with the Seventh-day Adventists and the Shakers and the, one of these millennial religions.
Yeah.
And I don't think that the leaders, if there is a second coming, I don't think they're preparing them for that, because it's not going to be a 2-year supply of food or having $124 billion socked away in the stock market is going to help. I think you have to be able to believe in something other than the scientific materialism, something more than the materialistic worldview.
Yeah.
You have to be able to believe that the universe has a soul, and that the galaxy has a soul, and the solar system has a soul. We have souls. We have to begin to believe in living things. We have to stop, when we see a horse, we should think about riding it and petting it and loving it instead of dissecting it. We have to stop tearing things apart and thinking that we get more knowledge by going down into smaller units. We have to be able to see animals and other people and even the solar system as a living thing.
Yeah.
But we don't. The leaders of the church don't encourage us to do that. They just encourage us to obey.
Yeah.
Pay, pray, and obey. Pay, pray, and obey is not going to help people.
No. And well, so some people somehow manage to go through life and that's it. But I think as soon as you have that moment where you say, I don't know, and I don't think they know either, that opens a whole kind of can of worms when it comes to you then look outside the leadership for an answer. And whether that's in prayer, whether that's in looking more closely at the Bible instead of the Book of Mormon, or looking at secular sources, but they would say that that's all anti-Mormon sources and different things because it's not on the church website, or it's not in the approved list that they give you to read, etc.
If only people did that. What I see happening is that people who were true believers become true non-believers. They go from fundamentalist belief to fundamentalist non-belief. And they don't go to exploring religion. They just become atheists. Now, I don't have judgment for this, because I think that if you've had a soured experience of religion, then I understand why you'd become an atheist. But I don't see Mormons leaving the church and becoming more spiritual. I see a lot of them just giving up entirely on religion altogether. That doesn't mean they're bad people or that they're going to go to hell or anything. I don't believe in hell. That's one of the selling points of Mormonism. We don't believe in hell, but they don't put that in the lead. They bury that we are universal. We believe in universal salvation. So to answer your question, I just think Mormonism is going to become less important for people. It become more fundamentalist, and therefore it'll just become irrelevant.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for your time. If you can wait right there, I'm in the fortunate position that we can carry on our conversation after the show's finished. But thank you everyone for tuning in. And just another big thank you to Paul for your insights and the stories, because you're looking from a totally different angle to many of us on the outside of Mormonism now, who have never, rubbed shoulders with prophets and apostles and spoken to them frankly. So that was just amazing to hear those things. Everyone out there, please share this interview, subscribe to the channel. If you feel you can support the blog, please leave a tip using the link below. And our next guest next week will be Clayne Wademan, who grew up in a polygamous sect called The Work, and he was one of 45 children. And we're going to find out how that affected him and where his life went after that very crowded upbringing. But thank you again, Paul. Thanks everyone for listening, and we'll catch you on the next one. See ya.